Suppose the federal government borrowed nothing new this year, not one additional dollar. Its interest bill would still be larger next year than it is today. That is not a forecast. That is a contract. On the 13th of August, the Treasury sold $25 billion of 30-year bonds, the kind that come due in 2056. Buyers demanded 5.216%. That was the highest yield at a 30-year auction since 2001. 4 days later, out in the open market, the 30-year yield touched 5.311%, highest since June of 2007. Those are the headlines. What I want to do here is the thing underneath the headlines, because it is quieter and a lot more useful. There are two interest rates in this story, and almost every conversation about the national debt washes them into one. There is the rate the government is already paying on money it already borrowed, and there is the rate it has to pay on money it borrows this morning. Those two numbers are currently very far apart. The distance between them tells you more about the next 10 federal budgets than any argument about spending does. So, how big is this line? Why does it grow on its own? And who decides it? In that order. Through the end of July, 10 months into the 2026 fiscal year, the federal government had spent $931 billion on interest. The same 10 months a year earlier came to $842 billion. That is 11% more in a single year. Divide it out and it works out to roughly $3 billion a day, every day, including today. Now, where does that sit in the budget? You may have seen a claim going around that interest is past Medicare in the military. Half of that is right, and I want to be precise about which half, because getting this wrong is how a channel loses you. Interest is not past Medicare. Using the Congressional Budget Office monthly figures, interest is the third largest category of federal spending this year, behind Social Security and behind Medicare. Third, not first. But the comparison that is true is arguably stranger. For the first 9 months of the fiscal year, interest cost about $20 billion more than the Department of Defense, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Education, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Small Business Administration combined. Here is one more figure, and it reframes the rest. The deficit for those same 10 months was $1.8 trillion. Interest was $931 billion of it, so more than half of everything the government borrowed this year. It borrowed in order to pay interest. And it is worth sitting for a second with what makes this line different from the two above it. Social Security buys retirement income. Medicare buys medical care. You can argue about whether either is the right size, but they purchase something that exists. Interest purchases nothing. It is the price of things that were already bought, in some cases decades ago. It is the one line in the budget where the money leaves and nothing arrives. Now the part I actually built this around. As of the 31st of July, the average interest rate across all interest-bearing federal debt was 3.447%. That same week, new 30-year money cost 5.216%. 3.4 on the old, 5.2 on the new. Both true at the same moment. That gap is not an error, and it is not two people disagreeing. It exists because the national debt is not alone. It is a stack of hundreds of separate contracts with different maturity dates, each one signed at whatever the going rate happened to be on the day it was signed. The average rate is a weighted average of every contract still alive. The 5.2 is the price of the contract signed this morning. And here is the mechanism. Those old contracts do not last forever. They come due. When a Treasury security comes due, the government does not usually pay it off. It sells a new one to cover it. That is called rolling the debt, and it is completely routine. But the new one is priced at today's rate, not at the old one, which means the interest bill can rise without a single new dollar of borrowing. Same debt, new price. It is worth knowing what that new price actually looks like being set, because it is not a negotiation. The Treasury announces an amount and a maturity, and then it takes bids. It does not name a rate. The buyers do. Everyone who bids at or below the clearing yield gets filled, and the last accepted bid sets the rate for the whole issue. On the 13th of August, the clearing number was 5.216. For every dollar of bonds on offer, about $2.39 was bid, and the primary dealers, the firms obliged to show up whether they want the paper or not, ended up taking 11.5% of it. The people who watch these auctions for a living read both of those as softer demand than usual, and the Treasury does not get to decline the result. It needed the money that day. The scale of this is easy to underestimate. Between April of 2025 and the end of March of 2026, about $9.3 trillion of publicly held debt came due. That is roughly a third of the whole thing, inside 12 months. Across the full 2026 fiscal year, the Government Accountability Office puts the refinancing need at $9.7 trillion, a third of the debt repriced every year. And of that $9.3 trillion, more than $3.1 trillion was issued 2 or more years earlier, back when money was much cheaper. Those contracts were not renewed at their old rate. They could not be. They were renewed at whatever the market wanted on the morning they matured. This has already happened once at enormous scale. Between March of 2022 and September of 2024, $21 trillion of federal debt matured and had to be reissued, and it was reissued at the highest rates in more than a decade. You can watch the result in one number. During the pandemic, the average rate across all federal debt fell to 1.6%, the lowest in more than 2 decades. By August of 2024, it was 3.3%, the highest since 2009. Today it is 3.447. Notice how slowly it moves. It does not jump, because the debt does not all mature at once. It climbs in steps as each batch of cheap contracts expires and is replaced, which is exactly why the bill keeps growing in a year when nothing extra is borrowed. The repricing was already scheduled. It was scheduled on the day those bonds were sold. The dollar figures follow the same staircase. Net interest was $352 billion in 2021, $881 billion by 2024, $952 billion in 2025. This year, it passes $1 trillion. One clarification, because you will see 2 different interest figures quoted and both are real. Of the roughly $40 trillion of federal debt outstanding, about $32 trillion is held by the public, investors, pension funds, foreign central banks, and a great many ordinary households through bond funds inside a retirement account. The remaining $7.5 trillion or so, the government owes to itself, mostly to trust funds like Social Security. Interest on that internal slice just moves from one federal account to another, which is why there is a gross number and a smaller net number. Net is what actually leaves the building, and net is what I have been quoting throughout. I want to put that next to something you might have in a drawer, because the contrast is the whole lesson. If you hold a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, you have something the United States Treasury does not have. Your rate was set on the day you signed, and it is set for 30 years. The market can do whatever it likes. Rates can go to 8 or back to 2, and the number on your contract does not move. Freddie Mac had the 30-year fixed averaging 6.67% in the middle of August. Whoever locked that in is locked in. The Treasury cannot do that with most of its borrowing. Its debt matures in months and in a few years, not in decades, so it has to keep walking back to the market and asking for a new price. A fixed rate buys certainty and pays for it in the rate. The government mostly borrows short, which is cheaper on the day, and repriced on every day after. I point that out because it is easy to read a story like this one and assume the small borrower is the one who got the worst deal. On this specific mechanism, the household with the fixed rate is holding the better contract. That is not a sentence you hear often, and it happens to be true. So who decides how large this line gets? Almost nothing in the federal budget happens by itself. Most spending has to be argued over, voted on and passed every single year. And when that process breaks down, the government shuts down. That is the normal machinery. Interest is not in that machinery, and it has not been for a very long time. Payment of interest on the public debt is what is called a permanent, indefinite appropriation. Permanent means no expiration date. Indefinite means no dollar limit. It sits today in Section 1305 of Title 31 of the United States Code in 11 words, to pay interest on the public debt under laws authorizing payment. That arrangement dates to 1847, coming up on 180 years. I want to be careful here because there is a lazy version of this fact, and it is wrong. Congress does vote on the debt ceiling, and that fight is very real. What Congress does not do is pass an annual appropriation for the interest itself. The money is available without anyone approving it, in whatever amount the existing contracts happen to require. And once you see why, it stops sounding like a loophole and starts sounding like a trade. If paying interest required a fresh vote every year, then everyone lending to the United States would be carrying the risk that 1 year the vote fails. Lenders price risk. They would demand more for it. Making the payment automatic takes that particular risk out of the deal, and the government borrows more cheaply as a result. 1847 bought a lower interest rate by giving up the ability to argue about it later. For most of those 180 years, that was a very good trade, and it may still be, but there is a cost that shows up in a year like this one. Interest comes off the top. Everything that does get voted on is competing for what is left. Added together in roughly 3/4 of federal spending, mandatory programs plus interest, never passes through the annual appropriations process at all. Is any of this unprecedented? Not entirely, and the comparison is the interesting part. Measured against the size of the economy, net interest hit its record in 1991 at 3.2% of gross domestic product. The Congressional Budget Office baseline puts this year at 3.3. So on that measure, the record is being passed. But the 1991 version was produced mostly by very high interest rates, sitting in a much smaller pile of debt. This one is produced by moderate rates sitting on a pile approaching $40 trillion. Same ratio, different engine. I'm not going to tell you where rates go from here, and if the channel tells you that, be suspicious. What I can tell you is what is already written down. The Congressional Budget Office baseline, published in February, has net interest going from about $1 trillion this year to $2.1 trillion this year to $0.1 trillion by 2036, and from 3.3% of the economy to 4.6%. That is their projection under current law, not mine. And baselines get revised. But it is what you get when contracts that already exist meet rates that already exist. And baselines can already be behind the room. The 10-year Treasury has spent most of the past month above 4.6%. which is more than 40 basis points higher than the level that projection was built on. That does not make the projection wrong. It makes it a floor rather than a forecast. One more thing worth separating out because it gets confused constantly. The Federal Reserve policy rate is currently 3.5 to 3.75%, and the Fed voted at the end of July to leave it there, with 3 members dissenting in favor of a hike. That rate is an overnight rate. The 5.3% on the 30-year bond is not set by that vote. It is set by whoever shows up to buy 30-year bonds. And that same long end is what sits underneath your mortgage rate, which is why a story about the federal interest bill and a story about the cost of a house are, mechanically, the same story. Here's what I would take out of all of this. And it is portable, which is the part I like. Almost every debt has 2 rates. There is the rate you are paying, which is an average of everything already agreed to, and there is the rate the market would charge for the same money today. On a fixed rate mortgage, those two can drift apart for 30 years, and it costs you nothing because it is locked. On a credit card balance, on an adjustable loan, on a home equity line, on anything at all that reprices, the gap between those two numbers is not trivia. It is a preview of the payments. And it is a question you can go and ask. Not what is my balance, which is the number every statement leads with. What rate is this balance carrying? And what would the same money cost today? 2 numbers instead of 1. If the second is higher than the first, some part of that difference is already scheduled to arrive. The federal government is simply the largest example of this that exists. Its average is 3.4. Its marginal is 5.2. And about a third of the distance between them gets converted from the first number into the second every year, automatically, without anyone voting on it. So go back to where we started. The government could borrow nothing new, and the bill would still grow, not because it took on more, but because the old debt came due. Refinancing is not saving, it is repricing.